Imagine driving a 600-ton furnace through a pitch-black tunnel made of solid rock. This is the truth about why the cab forward was a death trap. In the Sierra Nevada mountains, steam engines were killing their own crews. The smoke was so thick and the heat was so intense that men were passing out at the throttle. To fix it, the Southern Pacific did something crazy. They flipped the engine around and put the crew in the front. On paper, it was a masterpiece. It looked like the future. But inside those miles of snowsheds and tunnels, the solution created a whole new kind of nightmare. If the engine stalled, the cab did not just get hot, it turned into a gas chamber. If an oil line snapped, the crew was trapped in a box of fire with nowhere to run. The railroad called it progress. The men who drove them called it a gamble with their lives. But what happened when the iron finally pushed the mountain too far? A man's lungs fill with hot, black vapor. He is pinned between a steel firebox and a wall of rock, every breath scraping his throat raw. The only defense is a strip of wool, soaked and slapped over his mouth, the wet rag trick passed down from men who survived the last run through the 40-mile furnace. The logbooks are blunt. One entry reads, "Fireman lost consciousness at throttle. Smoke thick as tar." The date was March 8, 1919. The location was Donner Pass, buried in winter, sealed tight by snowsheds and tunnels. Inside the cab, the air is so thick with carbon that sweat boils on the skin. The crew's world shrinks to what they can feel: scorched oil on metal, the shudder of the articulated frame grinding against the rails, the hiss of the air pump fighting to keep the brakes alive. Visibility drops to nothing. One engineer wrote, "We could barely see the rails. The smoke was like a wall." That line ran in the Truckee Republican, January 1925. The mountain's breath is poison. 40 miles of enclosed track turned the cab into a box, no escape, no fresh air, just the slow, choking advance of invisible gas. The AC-12 was supposed to be the answer, but before that, the only option was to keep the engine moving and pray the draft would pull the exhaust away. Stall for even a minute, and the carbon monoxide climbs past 1,500 parts per million. That is enough to knock a grown man out in under 40 seconds. Crewmen learned to judge the risk by taste. If the air felt sweet and heavy, the next breath could be the last. No training prepared them for this. Official orders told crews to limit the throttle in tunnels, but the mountain did not care. The logbooks are full of men who passed out at the controls, rescued only when another train braved the tunnel to drag them out. The wet rag was a last stand, a desperate ritual against the mountain's indifference. Every run was a gamble against the box, the furnace, and the breath of Donner Pass. 7 miles of timber snowsheds stretched from the summit eastward, each one built as a shield against the Sierra's winter. Walls of cedar planks, pitched at a steep angle, fenced the tracks in a wooden tunnel, 40 miles of it across the mountain. Every winter, Donner Pass vanished beneath 35 to 40 feet of snow. In the worst years, drifts piled up to 70 feet deep, swallowing the sheds and the rails beneath. The sheds were supposed to be a barrier, but the climate pressed harder each season. Wind gusts scoured the ridge at 45 miles an hour, driving snow sideways and packing it tight against the shed roofs. The timber frames groaned under the load. Maintenance logs from the California State Railroad Museum show that 12% of snowshed roofs failed during the winters of the 1940s. That is nearly 1 in 8. Roofs collapsed by weight, were crushed by ice, or split open by fire. Each failure left the track exposed, but even standing sheds became traps for smoke and heat. Vents cut every 150 feet could not keep up. Crew complaints about visibility poured into the dispatch office, reporting that black clouds of smoke lingered for hours inside the sheds, making it difficult to see the track. The air inside turned thick and motionless, a stagnant haze hanging over the rails. Southern Pacific management tracked every incident. The snowshed register logged each collapse, each fire. Each day, the line was choked by smoke. The numbers told a story of constant risk. 40 miles of enclosed line, a 12% roof failure rate, and visibility complaints filed week after week. The pressure on the railroad was relentless. Every winter storm forced a new round of repairs, and every failed roof meant a scramble to keep the mountain route open. The infrastructure was stretched to its limit, and the only way forward was to find a design that could survive the mountain's breath and the furnace inside the box. The AC-12 was not a marvel to be admired from a distance. Up close, it was a machine built for survival. Every line and hinge a response to the mountain's relentless assault. Baldwin's shop drawings lay out the logic: flip the boiler 180 degrees, put the firebox in front, and drive the crew cab nose first into the darkness. The articulated frame, 2 engine units joined by a kingpin pivot, let this 600-ton furnace snake through the tightest curves on Donner Pass. The hinge, a slab of forged steel 6 inches thick, allowed a 15-degree swing side to side and 5 degrees up or down. Crews called it the backbone. The entire weight, over 250,000 pounds on the front drivers alone, pressed down as the locomotive flexed through the granite cuts and timber tunnels. Inside, the design was all about keeping men alive. The cab sat at the very front, ahead of the boiler, with the tender and its 5,000 gallons of oil riding point. The firebox throat, now just behind the windshield, could be serviced without crawling through a furnace. Oil lines snaked under the cab floor, feeding a duplex atomizer mounted 12 inches from the firebox throat. The pump, driven off the front engine's valve gear, delivered 200 pounds per square inch at full throttle, enough to vaporize fuel instantly. The atomizer itself was a simple device. Steam at 150 pounds per square inch blasted oil into a fine mist, droplets barely 15 microns across. The goal was total combustion, no smoke, no wasted heat, at least in theory. The exhaust system was reworked to match the new geometry. A long steam pipe arched over the cab, feeding the front cylinders. The draft-regulating blast pipe at the locomotive's rear had a widened throat, 2.5 inches across, to maintain vacuum even as the whole machine pushed through the mountain's breath. On paper, the back pressure stayed low, just 2 pounds per square inch at full cutoff, so the fire would draw, not choke. In practice, every joint and gasket was a potential failure. The cab was surrounded by thousands of pounds of pressurized oil and steam, all held in check by daily inspections, weekly flushes, and the hope that nothing let go when the furnace was at its hottest. This was the AC-12, a 124-foot articulated box built to fight the 40-mile furnace of Donner Pass. Every inch of it was engineered for one purpose: keep the crew moving, keep the mountain at bay, and hope the box didn't become a coffin. Southern Pacific's executive floor was thick with optimism. Internal memos from the engineering department, stamped confidential and copied to the general manager's desk, read like victory declarations. The logic was simple: move the crew in front of the exhaust, and the mountain's breath would be tamed. The cab forward was not a gamble, they insisted, but a calculated answer to the 40-mile furnace. In 1909, a feasibility study by Chief Engineer J. Signor said that placing the cab ahead of the boiler would eliminate crew exposure in the snowsheds and tunnels, where smoke in the enclosed line was a documented cause of incapacitation. Management pointed to the numbers. The oil-fired system, with its duplex atomizer, was designed to deliver 200 pounds per square inch of pressure, enough to atomize thick bunker oil into a fine mist that burned hot and clean. The atomizer was the heart of the new machine, a device that on paper would vaporize every drop of fuel for near total combustion. No smoke, no wasted heat. The engineering memos boasted of a 95% combustion efficiency, a figure meant to silence any doubts from the field. Visibility reports were filed with the same confidence. Dispatchers logged fewer complaints about blackouts in the snowsheds after the first cab forwards entered service. One memo dated May 1912 claimed that crewmen reported a clear view of the rails, even in heavy snow conditions. The company newsletter ran a photo of cab forward number 4000 emerging from snowshed 3. the crew's faces visible through spotless glass, framed by a plume of clean exhaust rolling behind them. The corporate narrative was one of progress. Each technical bulletin, each cost-benefit analysis, insisted that the AC-12 and its articulated frame had solved the mountain's worst hazards. The articulated hinge, the oil-fired atomizer, the reversed cab, each was presented as proof that the railroad could outthink Donner Pass. The boardroom language was confident. The box was no longer a coffin, and the 40-mile furnace had been conquered. But optimism on paper is not proof in the cab. The memos never mention the smell of scorched oil or the way the air would hang motionless when the train stalled deep inside the mountain. They do not record the fear that crept in when the atomizer's pressure gauge flickered or when the hiss of the air pump faded to silence. The company believed the flip was the solution. The men who worked the throttle would learn otherwise. 15 seconds. That's all it took for the world to vanish behind the glass. Smoke hit the cab like a black tide, rolling in faster than a man could curse. The AC-12's headlight, built for mountain darkness, could not punch through a wall of soot 5 feet thick. Crews called it the blink. One moment rails and ties, the next nothing but swirling ash. Visibility dropped to 0 before a man could count to 20. The articulated frame kept the engine moving, but the mountain's breath seeped in from every seam. Inside the box, time meant survival. The liquid fuel atomizer hissed at 200 pounds per square inch, vaporizing oil into a white-hot mist. That was the theory. In practice, the draft slowed, exhaust pooled, and the air turned sweet and heavy. The back pressure climbed. Carbon monoxide, invisible and silent, built up in the cab. Smoke velocity tests from the summit tunnel showed the vents could only clear 1.2 feet per second, far too slow for a 2,400 horsepower furnace. By the time the train stalled, the cab became an airtight cell. At the 30-second mark, the numbers turned deadly. Crew logs and Southern Pacific's own safety tests measured carbon monoxide at 1,500 parts per million in under 40 seconds. That's the threshold. Past it, consciousness slips away. Some men tried to hold their breath. Others pressed wet rags to their mouths, counting heartbeats, tasting the sour tang of oil and steel. But the gas was faster. In less than a minute, hands slipped from the throttle. Eyes rolled back. The air pump's hiss faded to nothing. The only sound left the slow, grinding shudder of the mountain's box. There was no warning, no gradual fade. The 40-mile furnace claimed its due in seconds, not hours. In the records, it is just a number. Visibility lost in 15, blackout in 40. But for the men in the cab, it was a countdown with no escape. Heat inside the box was never just an inconvenience. It was a loaded gun, cocked and waiting for the wrong sequence of failures. When the AC-12 stalled in a tunnel or snowshed, the temperature did not rise gradually, it vaulted. Maintenance memos from the Sacramento shops record cab thermometers spiking from 70 to 150 degrees Fahrenheit in under 10 seconds. The air became thick and wet, sweat boiling on arms and faces, every breath a searing drag through a furnace. Crewmen learned to dread the moment the draft failed. The articulated frame, meant to flex through granite curves, offered no escape. The cab, now at the nose, was a sealed cell pressed against the mountain's breath. The real terror was not just the heat, it was the oil. The AC-12's duplex atomizer, fed by a steel-braided hose running under the cab floor, delivered fuel at 200 pounds per square inch, enough pressure to vaporize oil in a heartbeat. But the hose, especially at the bend beneath the cab, was a weak link. Years of thermal cycling, vibration, and cold snaps in the Sierra worked the steel until it frayed from the inside. Shop records from 1944 and 1947 note repeated failures at this spot. Hose ruptured at cab bend, immediate flash fire. When a rupture hit, the outcome was instant and brutal. Oil under pressure sprayed into the cab as a fine mist. If it struck any hot surface, atomizer throat, firebox crown, or even the steel deck plate, It ignited in a flash, turning the crew compartment into a blowtorch. One documented incident in Hassan Tunnel measured the cab air at 150 degrees just before the rupture. The fireball consumed the oxygen in seconds. Crews had no warning, no time to reach for the emergency shutoff. The only evidence left behind was a scorched control stand and a melted gauge cluster. The company's technical bulletins called these events fuel system anomalies. For the men in the box, they were death sentences. The mountain's breath, the 40-mile furnace, and a single failed hose, each was enough to erase the line between survival and disaster. There was no margin for error. The AC-12 was a solution built on the edge of catastrophe. Official records from the Interstate Commerce Commission leave no room for nostalgia. The National Archives hold Report 14-2224, a freight train stalled inside Snowshed 7 on Donner Pass, crew found unconscious at their posts. The cause was not mechanical failure, but smoke, carbon monoxide, thick and invisible, filling the box before a man could reach for his rag. The Interstate Commerce Commission's own words stated that the crew lost consciousness due to accumulation of carbon-rich exhaust, and they recommended immediate adoption of locomotive designs placing crew forward of the exhaust source. A decade later, Interstate Commerce Commission Report 29-3117 documents the aftermath of an oil fire explosion in Snowshed 12. The investigation found that a ruptured fuel line sprayed atomized oil into the cab, igniting instantly. The snowshed roof burned, the crew never made it out. The Commission's directive was blunt. Phase out conventional oil-fired locomotives on the Donner corridor and reference the cab forward as the only viable alternative for survival in the 40-mile furnace. These findings are not footnotes. They are the backbone of every operational change that followed. The Interstate Commerce Commission's files, now catalogued in the National Archives ICCR 203 series, confirm what crews already knew. The mountain's breath was deadly, and the box could kill faster than any derailment or collision. By the early 1950s, the railroad's own maintenance logs read like a confession. The vent stacks cut into the snowshed roofs, those 2-foot pipes meant to pull the mountain's breath skyward, delivered a measurable drop in carbon monoxide, but only by 40%. Post-retrofit tests from the California State Railroad Museum archives show the air inside the sheds was less deadly, not safe. Crews still filed complaints about headaches, blurred vision, and the taste of oil on their tongues. The retrofits slowed the poison, but never cleared it. The fundamental problem remained: the geometry of the box, the sealed tunnels, the 40-mile furnace. No vent, no rag, no emergency procedure could guarantee survival if the train stalled. The railroad solution was not another round of technical fixes, but withdrawal. In 1955, Southern Pacific began phasing out steam on Donner Pass. The diesel-electrics arrived with forced ventilation, sealed cabs, and no exhaust in the crew compartment. The last AC-12 was retired, its articulated frame and forward cab consigned to the museum floor. For the men who worked the line, these changes came too late. The operational record is blunt. Retrofits bought time, not safety. The 40-mile furnace was never tamed. The cab-forward era ended not with a triumph, but with a quiet retreat from a mountain that would not yield. Operational reality still writes the last word on innovation. Today, railroads run with strict safety protocols, but every high-stakes shortcut leaves a blueprint for risk. The AC-12's articulated frame and liquid fuel atomizer solved one hazard only to breed another, proof that necessity alone never justifies design. Donner Pass keeps its lessons sealed in scorched steel and bone. Safety isn't an invention. Safety is an obligation. The mountain always collects what it's owed.